talked about animal advocacy, animal property of the law, introduction to animal rights, Reign Without Thunder, and his most recent book, Eat Like You Care, I think. And I think as most of you know, he's been a long-time advocate for animals and has a particular interest in veganism. Would you say that's right, Gary?
Sort of.
Yes. So he's going to talk to us about some of those issues today. So let's welcome Gary back to the program.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for coming out, and thank you, John, for having me. And it's nice to see you again after load these many years. Okay. I want to talk today about, and I think it's interesting that last week, Michael Vick, who's a football player who was arrested for dog fighting in 2007 and went to prison, came out and he went to play with the Philadelphia Eagles, and now he's been signed with the New York Jets. And last week, when he signed with the New York Jets, the hate speech on the internet about Michael Vick just went crazy, and people hate Michael Vick. They hate him. They don't just dislike him. They don't just object to what he does. They hate him, and I find this really interesting. I mean, and it's not just it's animal people hate him, but everybody hates him. I mean, it's like Michael Vick. People despise Michael Vick. I find that fascinating. Now, why is it that people despise Michael Vick? They despise Michael Vick because he made animals suffer. But in the society in which we live, a lot of people make animals suffer in all sorts of ways, and although some of us object to all of them, many of us don't. And so the question becomes, why is it? We get upset with Michael Vick, we think he's bad guy, he made animals suffer. Why is it that we get so incredibly mad, upset with him, to the point where wherever the guy shows up, there are demonstrations, read the stuff on the internet. It is actually, unfortunately, a lot of it strikes me as being just plain racism. But people are really angry with this guy. Why? Because he made animals suffer and he didn't have a good reason. Now, you say, well, wait a minute now. Yeah, did have a good reason. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed watching those dogs fight. He got pleasure, he got amusement out of the situation. And most of us, or many people, would say that's not enough. That in fact, there's something really wrong about that. It's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. It's wrong to do that. And however we interpret or unpack the concept of necessity, if that moral norm is going to make any sense whatsoever, it must exclude imposing suffering or death for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Because if you say, look, it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on X, but the necessity criterion is justified by saying you get pleasure, amusement, or convenience out of it, then you've got an exception that is so large you can drive a truck. I mean, you've now got an exception which renders the moral norm meaningless. Okay? So the reason why we get upset with Michael Vick is because he made animals suffer, and he did it only because he got pleasure and he found it amusing. And we say, that is barbaric. We don't just object to it. We don't just say, it's wrong. We say it's obscene, we get upset, we hate him, we wish him dead, all sorts of vehement, strong responses. The question becomes, though, we live in a society in which everybody gets upset about Michael Vick. But how is it that most of us are any different from Michael Vick? Because we don't live in a vegan world. Most of us eat animal products. Now, what is it? We eat animal products. Now, it is 2014. Nobody maintains that we need to be eating animal products to be optimally healthy. Indeed, the empirical evidence is pretty strong that animal products are detrimental to health. As a matter of fact, virtually every study coming out says in one form or another, animal products are bad for you. But you know what? Even if you don't buy that, even if you would like to put all of that empirical evidence aside, why you would, I don't know, but let's assume you say, look, I don't buy those studies. And I just don't think that it's bad to eat animal products. The answer is that the problem still remains. Nobody maintains that you're going to be healthier if you eat animal products, or that you can't have optimal health as a vegan. Okay? So we don't need to eat animal products for optimal human health. And animal products and animal agriculture is destroying the environment. I mean, it takes between 6 and 12 pounds of plant protein to produce 1 pound of flesh. It takes 1,000 times more water to produce a pound of flesh than it does a pound of potatoes. I mean, animal agriculture is responsible for deforestation, soil erosion, water pollution. I mean, we are contributing, animal agriculture contributes more to greenhouse gases than any single activity, including burning fossil fuels for transport. So you say, okay, fine, how many animals are involved? 57 billion. Do you understand what that number represents? A billion is 1,000 million. 57 billion land animals are killed every year for food. That does not include fish and other aquatic animals. What's the number there? Nobody knows. The lowest number I've ever seen is 1 trillion. 1 trillion is 1,000 million. I'm sorry, 1 million million. So we're talking about an unimaginable, at least for me, it's unimaginable. I mean, I can't get my head around those numbers, that we are killing 57 billion land animals and a trillion sea animals every year. What's the best reason we have? We don't need to do it for health. We can be vegans just fine. We don't have to eat any animal products. We don't have to eat flesh. We don't have to eat dairy. And by the way, those of you who are into vegetarianism, I have bad news for you. You can't, that's not a morally coherent position. There is no morally coherent distinction between meat and other animal foods. As a matter of fact, animals used for dairy are kept alive longer, they're treated every bit as bad, and they all end up in the same slaughterhouse anyway. So this idea that, well, should we be vegetarians? The answer is, that's like saying, is it okay for me to eat the meat from a big cow but not a small cow, or a spotted cow but not, it's a crazy line to draw, right? So what is the best justification we have for imposing suffering and death on 57 billion land animals and 1 trillion sea animals? And the answer is no better than it tastes good. That's it. It's habit. We do it. It's convenient. I'm going home at night. I don't want to cook anything, so I stop and I get a big death burger or whatever, or something. What is? I mean, it's. I said I had a very bizarre experience before I came here. I was talking with a friend, guy at the university, and he's sitting there eating one of these burgers, and it's got like a beef patty, and it's got bacon, and it's got cheese, and then it's got this sauce on it that I don't even know what it had in it. It's sitting on top of a bun that probably had absolutely no fiber and tons of sugar. And he says to me, "Can you be healthy as a vegan?" I said, look at what you're eating. Look at what you're eating, and you're asking me whether or not the way I eat is healthy. I mean, but this is the way we think. So the bottom line is we cannot justify what we're doing with the best reason we have is it tastes good, it's convenient, we like it. How does that make us any different from Michael Vick? And the answer is it doesn't. You cannot draw a morally coherent distinction between Michael Vick and any non-vegan. Now you can say, wait a minute, how about the fact that Michael Vick did it himself? And I don't do it. I go to the store and buy it. I don't take pleasure in the suffering of animals. I like the taste, but I don't really take pleasure in the actual suffering. Okay? And Michael Vick took pleasure in the suffering. Is that relevant? And the answer is, well, it may be relevant. It may tell us something about Michael Vick's psychology. It might make an interesting statement about his psychology. Does it say anything interesting about morality? And the answer is not at all. As a matter of fact, in criminal law, if I want you dead, and I hire someone to kill you, okay, and I say, look, you know, I'm going to hire somebody to do this because I'm not really very good at it, and this person I've hired, this person likes to do this sort of thing, and I don't really like the suffering. I mean, I want you dead, but you know, if you're going to suffer, and you know, I don't want to, you know, I'm sort of into nonviolence, and you know, I don't want you to suffer, and I don't want to see your suffering, and I take no pleasure in your suffering. But what I do take pleasure is in the end product of you being dead. I hire somebody to kill you. Got news for you. It's murder in both cases. As a matter of fact, ironically, if the person who actually does the killing, there are situations in which you can conceive of that person having actually less culpability because they might, their state of mind, depending on what their state of mind is, they might be guilty of manslaughter and not murder. But I am guilty of murder. When I coolly give you the money and say, go and kill X, okay? Murder. And probably murder for you too, but maybe manslaughter, which is a lesser culpability, which is a lesser degree of culpability. So why does the criminal law say it's murder for both? I mean, why did it say, well, you know, you just gave him the money, that person did the killing? And the answer is because I caused it. I caused it. The fact that I didn't actually plunge the knife or pull the trigger is irrelevant. It's irrelevant, and the criminal law reflects the moral reality that there is no moral distinction between my asking you or paying you to kill somebody and you killing that person. There is no distinction. There is no moral distinction so as to justify different levels of culpability, except ironically, the person who actually does pull the trigger might have a lesser degree of culpability. So the fact that Michael Vick did it himself, the fact that Michael Vick did it himself and that we don't, or at least most of us don't, you know, I mean, some people go hunting and they do it themselves, but, you know, we go to the store, we buy it, we buy the milk, we buy the eggs, we buy the cheese, we buy the meat, we buy the fish, we buy the chicken, okay? And we buy them in packages, and most of us think of ourselves as animal lovers. How many people in this room have non-human companions they live with? Yeah, 80% of the people. What's the difference between the animal you love and the one you stick a fork into? That's a rhetorical question. The answer is there is no difference. There is no difference. There's no moral difference. Absolutely no moral difference. And what I find so curious is that as a cultural matter, we see, you know, Michael Vick is actually sort of an extreme example, but there are lots of examples of like this, where people get really angry, and not just, you know, peeved, but seriously angry about situations in which animals are harmed. And those situations are generally involve imposing suffering and death, and there's no good reason. You know, many people get upset when animals are used in vivisection, for example. I oppose vivisection. I don't think we should be using animals in any sort of experiment. But most people think it's, you know, they think, well, it's really unfortunate, but we have to do this, you know, to find important data that we need for human health. I don't think that's nonsense, but there are a lot of people who believe that. So it's not that people are unwilling to accept that in certain circumstances it's acceptable to impose suffering or death on animals. It's just that they don't think it's acceptable if the only justification is pleasure, amusement, or convenience. The problem is that's the only justification that we have. The only justification we have is pleasure, amusement, convenience to justify suffering and death of 57 billion land animals and 1 trillion sea animals. Okay? I mean, look, the bottom line is Michael Vick likes sitting around a pit watching dogs fight. Most of us like sitting around the summer barbecue pit roasting the corpses of animals that have had lives and deaths that are probably worse than Michael Vick's dogs. And indeed, we'll sit around the summer barbecue pit, you know, cooking those hamburgers or those steaks and talking about how much we think Michael Vick is a bad guy. I mean, it's a very confused way of thinking. I remember when Vick came out of prison in 2009, he signed with the Eagles. I was at a gasoline station, and at this particular gasoline station, it was one of these, I don't know if you have them in Canada, but because as Americans we are not allowed to have any period of time in which media is not blasting us. I'm at the pump, you know, and there's a screen. I mean, there's a screen on the damn pump, right? And there's talking, you know, there's stuff coming out of this, you know, there's screen on a gas pump. Anyway. And so this woman is talking, this news person is talking about how Michael Vick signed with the Eagles, and he was getting a lot of money and whatnot. And so I'm filling my car. There's a guy on the other side of the island, and he's seeing this and hearing this as well, and he says, "So, what do you think about Vick signing with the Eagles?" And I didn't really have the heart to tell him that. I've never seen a football game in my life, and I don't, as a matter of fact, when the whole Michael Vick thing broke, I thought he was a basketball player, but literally, I wrote an essay. 2007, I wrote an essay because I was so sick of hearing about Michael Vick because it was nonstop. It was unbelievably bizarre, and so I wrote an essay called "We Are All Michael Vick." That was the essay I wrote. And I gave it to my partner, Anna, and I said, "Could you please read this and see if it's okay?" And she read it, and she said, "I only have one change." And I said, "Well," she says, "he's not a basketball player." But, so I was really happy because it wouldn't have been embarrassing. But anyway, so I'm at the gas station. I'm filling the car. Guy's on the other side. He says, "What do you think about Vick?" I said, well, I said, interesting. And he said, he said, "I love the Eagles." He said, "But I don't think I'm ever going to be able to go to an Eagles game again." And I said, "Why's that?" And he said, "Well," he said, "what do you mean? Why? Michael Vick." And I said, "Yeah, I understand." I said, but what about Michael Vick?" He said, "Every time I see that son of a bitch, I'm going to think about what he did to those dogs." Busy filling up, and I said, "I see." I said, "Let me ask you a question." I said, "When you go to football games, do you eat like hamburgers and stuff like that?" And he looked at me and said, "The story of my life is our conversation." And so, he said, "Well, yeah." And so, and I said, "Well," I said, "the next time you're there and you're eating that hamburger, keep in mind that that animal in that bun probably had a much worse life and a much more violent death, although obviously there was quite a bit of violence with it. But that basically that animal you're eating was tortured." And I said, "And then while you're at it, remember that these guys are running around with they're wearing a lot of leather, which is the skin of an animal. They're throwing a ball around, which is the skin of a pig. And there are tons and tons of animal products that are involved in the playing of football, both as a matter of the actual game and as a matter of the things which are sold that people consume while they are watching the game." And we ended up, he actually asked me, he said, we filled up our cars and there were other people waiting, so he said, "Well, let's talk about this." And so we went over and he actually asked me, he said, "So you're an animal rights person?" I said, "Well, and so we had this kind of, but it was very interesting, the reaction I got. And I told him, I said, "Look," I said, I said, "this doesn't make any sense." And it was interesting because he didn't really know what to say. The reason he didn't know what to say is because there is nothing to say to that. There's absolutely no response to that. Sorry, there isn't. And if one of you, I will tell you what, I'll make a deal. You come up with a good justification, I'll give you $1,000. Because I have yet to hear. And it's interesting, when I published the essay, "We're All Michael Vick," I published it it was published in the Philadelphia Daily News. Because I thought it would be good to be in Philadelphia because of the Eagles. So I sounded really sort of sports conscious when I said Eagles, Philadelphia. And so I put it in Philadelphia Daily News, and within 3 days I got thousands of emails. And it was very interesting that they were pretty evenly divided, with about half people saying, "This is really interesting. I've never thought about it this way before," and the other half wishing I was dead. And so, and people were really angry. They were angry that I was saying that if you're not a vegan, then get off your high horse about thinking that you're morally superior to Michael Vick, because basically we're all in it together. And so, and it was, and some of the people that I actually responded to, the people who were like, there were levels of anger. And obviously the people who are very angry, I'm not going to engage. But there were people who who said, this is I disagree with what you're saying and blah, 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 and, I think you're being, and I wrote back to, I don't know, 10 or 15 of them, and I said, tell me why I'm wrong. I said, I'm really sort of curious. Not one reply that I get, not one reply that I get, and the answer is, there is no reply. And so, we think that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. Whatever necessity means, we know it's got to exclude imposing suffering for pain, or imposing suffering and death for reasons of pleasure, amusement, and convenience. But that's the only justification we have for 99.999999999% of what we do with animals. As a matter of fact, the only use of animals that we make that isn't transparently frivolous is the use of animals for biomedical research. Now, I don't think we should be doing that, and I don't think we get any. Well, we may learn something from using animals. The bottom line is, it's immoral. Whether we learn, whether we don't learn, I don't really care. It's immoral. But at least, that's not transparently frivolous. Because at least you can make the argument. You can make the argument plausibly. Whether it's a good argument or not, is a separate question. But you can make the argument plausibly that there's some necessity involved there. Okay? There's some empirical necessity. If you don't do this, you won't get data. Now again, I think that that's suspect as an empirical claim. But at least you can make it. It doesn't sound ridiculous. But to say I agree that, or I believe it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals, but I think it's all right to use animals for circuses, zoos, rodeos, and as food. It's all right to use them for entertainment purposes, which by definition aren't necessary. Okay? And use them for food. And the main thing, look, whatever else we do with animals, the main thing is what we eat. I mean, with the number of, and you know what? Nothing is ever going to change for animals as long as we're eating them. Once we stop eating them for moral purposes, everything changes. And this is one of the many reasons why I don't really have a whole lot of interest in single-issue campaigns. You're never going to change the world with anti-fur campaigns, particularly since there's no distinction between leather and wool and silk and whatnot. It's all the same. I mean, you can go yelling at people with fur coats. Most people don't yell at people with leather jackets because they're afraid of getting their teeth removed. But the reality is nothing's ever going to change, ever, 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 as long as we're eating them. Nothing. And once we stop eating them, and once we say, "Wow, I can't do this. This is immoral. This is wrong," then some guy asked me this morning. He said, "Well, what's your position? What position should I take on clothing?" And I said, once you go vegan, once you stop eating them, it'll be clear to you what you should do. You won't want, it will be clear to you that you shouldn't go and buy leather. And so, now the next question becomes, how did we get here? I don't mean today, I mean not in this room. But how did we get here in terms of why are we so confused about this issue? Why is it that we can't seem to think our way out of a paper bag when it comes to this? And I would suggest that, and I thought about this a lot, and I think it has to do with the fact that those of us, and I would say that most people, not everybody, or at least many people, let me be conservative for once in my life, many people believe that animals have, the animals matter, and they care about animals, okay? How is it that people like that can't see this issue? And I think the reason for that is because people have convinced themselves that it's all right to use animals for our purposes, even if they're unnecessary purposes, as long as we don't make them suffer. As long as we don't make them suffer, the use of the animals per se is not a problem. It's the treatment of the animals that is the problem. I believe that is what most people think about this issue. So they'll think, yeah, Vic shouldn't have done it because those animals suffered and this is really terrible and he had no good justification, but it's all right for us to use animals. Killing animals per se is not a bad thing as long as we don't make them suffer and we kill them painlessly. Now, where does this come from? The answer is it's our conventional wisdom, and it comes straight out of the animal welfare way of looking at things, which comes out of the 19th century. As a matter of fact, in many ways, our thinking about animals is no different from the way it was in 1830. Now, it really isn't. As a matter of fact, it's probably less progressive. But I mean, it's certainly not in any way significantly different from the way it was in 1830. Now, let me just give you a quick history lesson. I'll try not to bore you. Before the 19th century, at least as far as Western thinking was concerned, animals were excluded completely from the moral community. They were regarded as things as not having any moral value. Now, there were certain reasons offered to justify excluding animals from the moral community and treating them as things. You had people like Rene Descartes, the mathematician and scientist. Now, Descartes, what did Descartes say? Descartes said animals aren't sentient. He basically thought that they were machines. You know, he thought that God created animal machines. You know, we create machines. We create clocks and, you know, computers and whatever. And God creates animals. He called them automatons. He did not believe they were sentient. Sentience is not, you know, not a complicated concept. It means subjectively aware, perceptually aware. To say that a being is sentient means nothing more than to say that being is subjectively aware of things. Okay? And so Descartes did not believe that animals were subjectively aware. He called them automatons. Now, if he in fact is empirically correct, we can't have any moral obligations that we owe animals. Because if you're not sentient, you have no interests, by which I mean you have no preferences, desires, or wants. I can't harm you, because harming means to adversely affect your interests. If you ain't got no interests, I can't adversely affect you, okay? So, you know, plants are alive, but they have no central nervous system, they have no benzodiazepine receptors, they are not sentient, okay? I mean, when you eat a plant, you are not harming the plant because the plant has no interest. Now, I know, given the history of my life, I can tell you that there is at least one person in this room who's got an issue and wants to talk about plant rights. Just wait until the end. We'll do this. I mean, as a matter of fact, I do not believe I have ever given a talk anywhere on the planet about this subject, and I've been in a lot of places, without getting the plant question. And so it may not happen today. This may be a new start for me. But you know, last night in Western Ontario, we had a guy who was like, you know, he was obsessed about plants and wouldn't stop. And it was, I mean, he was very nice. You know, he's Canadian. He was very polite. You know, very polite. He was very, he was very nice. He was very, you know, but he was insistent on you know, well, why, you know, what about plants? Kept on talking about their yearning to exist, and I said, no, if you have no mind, you can't yearn about anything. You know, yearning, desiring, is something that requires that you have something cognitive going on. Plants don't have anything cognitive going on. Okay, so if Descartes was right, then we can't, whatever we do to animals rather, we can't adversely affect them because they don't have any interests. All right? You can have obligations that concern them, but not obligations that you owe to them. I can have an obligation to this water bottle, or an obligation that concerns this water bottle. I can't have an obligation to the water bottle that I owe. I have an obligation, for example, not to throw it at Michael, but that's not an obligation I owe to the water bottle. That's an obligation I owe to Michael that concerns the water bottle. Okay? Now, Descartes was somewhat unusual in the history of philosophy in that basically most people accepted as an empirical proposition that animals were sentient, that they were subjectively aware, that they were able to feel pain, they were able to suffer. Descartes did not believe that they could suffer. So he was a vivisector, amongst other things. And he would cut animals up, and they didn't have anesthesia at that time. They didn't have it for several hundred years after that, until several hundred years after that. And Descartes would cut them up. He would nail dogs to boards, and then he would cut them up, and they would scream, and then people would say, you know, Rene, what are you doing? And he would say, those are not really screams. That's like a machine that needs oil. You know, that he thought that there was no difference between a machine that needed oil and the dog. The dog was whining. The dog was making a noise that was similar to the whine of a machine that needed oil. I mean, this is what this, you know, guy said. Okay, now, most people did not take that position. Most people recognized that animals did have interests, okay? That they did have preferences, desires, and wants, that they were subjectively aware, that they had some sort of mind. But we could treat them as if they were things, as if they were Cartesian machines, and ignore their interests and exclude them from the moral community entirely. And how did they do that? They said, well, you had some people who said, we're made in God's image, they're not. So they're spiritually inferior to us. God made us in God's image and gave us animals to use. Animals are of lesser spiritual, of lesser value because of the way God has constructed the universe. And then there were people who said they were natural inferiors, okay? That basically because our minds were more sophisticated, we can reason, we can use abstract concepts, we use symbolic communication, and animals don't. They are inferior to us. They are cognitive or natural inferiors to us, okay? And so it's all right for us to treat them as if they were Cartesian machines, exclude them from the moral community, regard them as automatons, okay? And ignore their interests and pretend that they are machines, okay? And then there were people who combined them, like you have Thomas Aquinas, for example, who was a Catholic theologian, and he believed that animals didn't have souls, but he also believed that they weren't rational. Okay, so so it's okay for us to do, and to the extent actually, that people before the 19th century recognized that we had any obligations, they were obligations that concerned animals, not that we owed to animals. So you had people like Kant, people like Aquinas, saying, well, we should be nice to animals because if we're not nice to animals, we're going to be cruel to each other. But that's like the water in the Michael in the water bottle. I have an obligation to be nice to animals, not because I owe anything to the animal, but I owe something to you, not to treat you cruelly. And so if I treat animals cruelly, it's going to maximize the chances that I treat you cruelly, and that violates my moral obligation to you. It has nothing to do with the animal. Now, all of this changes fairly dramatically in the 19th century. I mean, it's in the history of ideas, it's actually quite remarkable how quickly it changes. And it changes as a result of some social reformers in England who were concerned about race-based slavery, concerned about women's rights and voting, concerned about the treatment of children. And they were looking at society and saying, look, there's a lot of bad stuff going on. We really got to change things. And one of the things they focused on, and these people were like Jeremy Bentham, Humphrey Primat, John Stuart Mill, the sort of liberal reformers of the early 19th century. And what they were saying was that, look, animals, we've been excluding animals, but we can't. We can't justify that. And so what do you have? You have people like Jeremy Bentham saying, look, animals are probably more rational, they certainly are more rational and more conversant than an infant, of a very young infant. That basically you can interact with a dog. It appears as though the dog is cognitively there's more going on than with a baby of a couple days old. They sort of sit there, they don't do much, and they're cute and all, but they don't do much. And so Bentham says, look, animals do have more sophisticated cognitive characteristics than we have given them credit for. But even if they didn't, he says, even if they didn't, what difference does it make? What matters is that they can suffer. And if they can suffer, we cannot exclude them from the moral community and not take into account their interest in not suffering and not give them moral value. We can't do that simply because of species. And then he says, that's like, we have people who are slaves, and we ignore their interests because of their skin color. And he says, you can't use skin color to exclude a sentient being from the moral community. You can't use species to exclude a being from the moral community. Now,